What's going on, guys? I hope you're doing well and I appreciate you tuning in. I've got something a bit different for you guys today, and I'm not just talking about the new backdrop, but it's no accident that I've parked myself next to the old CRT TV, because today we're dipping into a bit of Super Nintendo as I share some childhood memories and run through my favourite nostalgic SNES games. Let's rip into it. As you know already, if you follow the channel, the focus for my collection is very much 80s and 90s action figures. That's what fills up this room for the most part. But I've always wanted this room to be more than just display space, but to be a functional space where I can come in here, chill out, kick back, and make use of it above and beyond display. And since I last did a collection room tour video, I've made progress not only with the details and the action figure setup, but also with this little area here, the VHS display, the debut movie posters that I've finally got framed and up on the wall, and of course updating the TV. So the Panasonic CRT TV that you see behind me, this was actually our family TV. This thing was in our living room in the 90s. And when I found this TV in my dad's storage, I just had to get it in here. So we switched out the old Sony Trinitron, set up the Panasonic here, and I've got to tell you guys, it is just the best feeling to kick back in here and play a bit of Super Nintendo. It transports me back and it's just awesome. So speaking of Super Nintendo I consider like the console of my childhood. Prior to the SNES, I had the Sega Master System 2. That was fun. Definitely got some fond memories playing that. But getting the Super Nintendo on Christmas of 1993, making that change from 8-bit to 16-bit, just next level. So I'm really having fun collecting some of these nostalgic Super Nintendo games. But unlike the way I approach vintage action figures, where I'm trying to complete certain toy lines from the era of my childhood, when it comes to video games, when it comes to Super Nintendo specifically, all I'm going for is the games that I had as a kid. That was my goal. My goal wasn't about making a complete set or even having a large collection. The goal was just to pick off the games that I played as a kid regularly, whether it was games that I owned, games that I rented quite a lot, or games that close friends of mine from school had, and again, I've got fond memories playing those. And I said that was my goal because recently my mate Enzo was kind enough to gift me one of those games and completed that list that I'd set out. So I thought now's as good a time as any to make a video where, first of all, I thank Enzo for sending that game my way because I really do appreciate it, but also just share some of these childhood memories playing Super Nintendo because they were some of my favourite memories of my childhood, and also run through my favourite nostalgic games from that era. So we're doing a top 5, but before we rip into the top 5, I thought, why not rattle off a couple of quick honorary mentions, and there's no better place to start than the game that Enzo hooked me up with. Now, I'm probably going to reiterate this a couple of times throughout this video, but my favourite nostalgic Super Nintendo games are by no means the best Super Nintendo games. Some of these games are good games, and nostalgia aside, still hold up to this day. Others, objectively speaking, probably aren't that good at all, but these are the games that I played as a kid. These are the games that I've got those fond memories of. And the first honourable mention, the game that Enzo was kind enough to send my way, is probably a pretty good example of that. We've got Blues Brothers, a platform game that really doesn't make a lot of sense or bear much resemblance to the movie that it's based on. But I just had too much fun playing this game not to give it a mention. If I remember correctly, this was one of those gifts to me and my brother to share, you know, those kind of sibling gifts that your parents or grandparents get you. And all of my memories playing Blues Brothers are playing with my brother in 2-player cooperative mode, you know, navigating colourful levels and riding snakes and shooting lawnmowers with vinyl records and getting ridiculously jacked eating cake. Whenever I was playing this game, I was playing it with my brother and having a great time. So for that reason, it has to get a mention. Rock and roll. The next honourable mention is another side-scroller based on an iconic movie from back in the day, Home Alone. A game that is just nowhere near good enough to crack my top 5, but I've still got a lot of nostalgia for it. We owned this game back in the day and I had a lot of fun playing it. So the purpose of Home Alone is to run around the McAllister mansion, collecting all the valuables and sending them down the laundry chute for safekeeping, while either avoiding or taking out the wet bandits with a variety of weapons or luring them into traps. Now, some elements of Home Alone deviate massively from the movie. The wet bandits, for instance, have a whole team of thugs working for them, And also, oddly enough, when you get to the end of each level, you've got to face a final boss consisting of like a giant spider or a ghost. Something I definitely don't remember from the film. One last honourable mention before we rip into the top 5, NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Now, back in the early 90s, I was all about the NBA. In a lot of our family photos from that era, I got the NBA team hats and jerseys on. I used to love collecting the NBA trading cards, and I was obsessed with playing NBA Jam any chance I got. And there's just so much to love about NBA Jam. The fairly realistic depictions of the players, at least by early 90s standards, contrasting with the completely unrealistic gameplay, the over-the-top jumps and acrobatic dunks, the catchphrases from the commentators, the awesome soundtrack. NBA Jam is awesome. With that said, I rarely had a chance to play NBA Jam on Super Nintendo. It was one of my favourite arcade games to play back at that time, so any chance I got, I was dumping 20-cent coins into NBA Jam arcade machines in our area. The only time I really remember playing NBA Jam on Super Nintendo was at public kiosks when I had the chance. At hotels, you know, as a kid, or holiday kids clubs and those sorts of things. So it wasn't often I had a chance to play NBA Jam on Super Nintendo, but I loved this game so much back in the day that I needed it for the collection and I needed to give it a quick mention. So there we go. Last honorable mention, NBA Jam Tournament Edition. He's on fire! Kicking us off at number 5, we've got an awesome side-scroller, a game that I was never lucky enough to own as a kid, but rented it from the video store many times, and I'm talking about Donkey Kong Country. Now, I'd had my Super Nintendo for probably close to a year or so when Donkey Kong Country came out, and I just remember being blown away by the graphics, regardless of the level, regardless of whether it was swinging through the jungle, or swimming underwater, or riding in a runaway minecart. The visuals were just a massive step up on anything I'd seen to that point. And I just remember for the overnight period of the rental, because when this thing came out it was like $6 overnight. For that overnight period, I used to just get lost in the world of Donkey Kong Country. It was just awesome. From a gameplay standpoint, I used to love that it was Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong navigating each level together, so if one character took a hit, you could continue the level as the other character, and it just gave you that helping hand in working your way through each level. The flip side of the coin was that because I only had this game for an overnight rental at a time, I never had a chance to really make any real headway or get close to finishing it. But for that short period of time, it was just the best. So Donkey Kong Country had to break the top 5. Next up in number 4, we've got another iconic Super Nintendo banger, and I'm talking about Super Mario Kart. Super Mario Kart was so much fun back in the day, and honestly, in my opinion, still holds up really well to this day. I loved how Nintendo took all of the elements of Super Mario World, not just the characters, but also the playing environments, and applied that beautifully to a really fun, accessible racing format. And it's not just about the racing. Obviously, a big part of what makes Super Mario Kart so special is the weapons that you'd use, the red and green shells, banana skins, invincibility stars, all the other power-ups to make sure you cross the finish line first. And it was just so fun. Even though for the most part I played Super Mario Kart as a kid in single player mode, I love the split view showing your position on the track map, or the rear view in the case of attacks. And once again, just like Donkey Kong Country, it's a game that I wasn't lucky enough to own, but I rented this thing probably more than any other game as a kid, any other Super Nintendo game for sure. And unlike Donkey Kong Country, I felt like I could get a really good run at Super Mario Kart just in one day, because you'd plug it in and you'd be straight into it, and it was just the best. So Super Mario Kart is number 4. As we get to the top 3, I want to once again remind you that this is certainly not my take on the greatest Super Nintendo games. These were just the ones that I was lucky enough to play as a kid, that I've got the fondest memories for. And with that said, number 3 for me is a 3D combat racer that I absolutely loved as a kid, and I'm talking about Rock and Roll Racing. This game sees you race your way through different tracks on post-apocalyptic planets, earning money so you can buy increasingly futuristic weaponized cars with tank treads and hovercrafts, and earning more money and customizing those cars with performance mods and weapons and armor systems to suit the changing environments. And it's fucking awesome. I used to love playing Rock and Roll Racing as a kid. And as the name would suggest, Rock and Roll Racing has an awesome soundtrack with cool 16-bit versions of iconic songs like Born to be Wild and Bad to the Bone. The game's got awesome colourful characters like playable racers from all different worlds like My Guy Snake Sanders, all sorts of crazy looking villains like Roadkill Kelly, and the real life racing announcer Larry Supermouth Huffman. Now this was another game that I didn't own as a kid, but one of my mates from school, Robbie Hogan, did, and we'd do sleepovers at his joint and just play this game non-stop, and those memories have Rock and Roll Racing firmly planted in the top 3. So yeah, highly recommend Rock and Roll Racing, and shout out Robbie Hogan. Now it's important to note that with so many Super Nintendo games based on various licenses, a big contributing factor to my favourite games as a kid was the shit that I was into, and in 1993 I loved nothing more than the World Wrestling Federation. So at 2 on my list, we've got WWF Royal Rumble. Now this game featured the best wrestling gameplay that I'd experienced up until this point. There's a bunch of different match formats. You've got singles matches, tag team, 6-man tag team, and my personal favourite, the Royal Rumble. An over-the-top rope battle royal format featuring all 12 wrestlers that made up the roster of WWF Royal Rumble. And speaking of the roster, it was pretty damn awesome. No Hulkster, but all the other major stars of the era were covered. We had Bret Hart, we had Razor Ramon, Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker, just to name a few. The wrestlers looked great, they looked how they were supposed to. The quality of graphics were great for the era, the entrance music was well represented, and the wrestlers even all had their own signature finishing moves, which was awesome. Few things were as satisfying for me in 1993 as dropping the Razor's Edge or the Tombstone Piledriver playing Royal Rumble in my bedroom back in the day. It was just awesome. Also, the gameplay allowed for brawl matches, which meant you could go outside the ring with no DQs, no timeouts, hit your opponents with a steel chair, and I always appreciated that feature back in the day. Now I've mentioned that this was a game that I was given on Christmas morning of 1993 with some of my favourite childhood memories, and it got a ton of play. I'll be the first to admit that it doesn't quite hold up as well to this day as some of the other games on this list, but if we're talking pure nostalgia, it's right up there.
1, 2, 3.
And we bring it home with number 1, my favourite, most nostalgic Super Nintendo game, the game that made me want an SNES in the first place, Street Fighter 2. Now when I got this game packed in with the Super Nintendo console for Christmas, I was already hooked on Street Fighter 2 from playing the arcade version. Like I've mentioned previously, I loved playing the arcade version of the game at our local shops, so just the notion of having this game at my disposal to play from the comfort of my bedroom, because I'd just become the proud owner of a small CRT TV that was handed down from my parents, to be able to play the game non-stop without fear of running out of 20-cent coins was just mind-blowing to me. Although it's outdated by 30 years, to me Street Fighter 2 is the quintessential fighting game. The cast of characters were awesome. I love that they were a really varied mix of fighters of different styles and backgrounds from all over the world. You had more traditional martial artists like Ryu and Ken and Chun-Li up against kind of crazy mutant hybrid humans like Blanka and Dalsim. As a kid, the fighting had that great mix of what felt kind of like real martial arts at the time, mixed with like all the crazy surreal fireball attacks. The special moves are awesome, and the different styles of each of the fighters meant you had to approach each bout a little bit differently. The backgrounds look wicked with lots of detail and elements you could interact with, like crates that you could break, and the music, sound effects and voices were all on point. I just had so much fun with this game, but I remember getting so invested in it that I lost the plot with frustration numerous times back in the days when swearing meant running the risk of getting my mouth washed out with soap. So I was super into Street Fighter 2, so it's a no-brainer for number 1 on my list, my favourite nostalgic Super Nintendo game. So there you have it for my favourite nostalgic Super Nintendo games of my childhood. And now that I've shared mine, I'd love to hear yours, whether you had childhood favourites or whether you have favourite Super Nintendo games that have held up well to this day. If you're still banging it out on the Super Nintendo, definitely let me know in the comments. Now that I've ticked off the childhood list, I'm not necessarily looking to grow the collection dramatically, but if I find games that appeal to me in my travels and they're at the right price, I'd certainly consider scooping them up. because really all the toy lines that I collect for the most part were accompanied by video games, especially Super Nintendo games. So it's nice to have those represented in the collection. So let me know if there's any other ones I should be keeping an eye out for. But with that, I'm going to wrap this video up there. I really appreciate you guys watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you've made it this far, you're a dead set champion. I want to thank Enzo once again for gifting me with the Blues Brothers game. I really appreciate it, brother. And guys, that's it. I appreciate everyone that watches and gets behind me. I hope to hear from you in the comments. Have a great week, and until the next one, cheers.